Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As I mentioned last time, today we're going to talk a little bit about the war on cancer. It's interesting, I was around when all this took place originally, and I remember that medicine didn't have much of a clue back then in 1971, and I guess today they may have some clues, but they still are doing the same old thing they were doing back in 1971 pretty much, and with the same results they were getting in 1971. Now, if you remember, I held up this piece of paper. This was the headline that was in the newspaper. Nixon signs $1.6 billion cancer bill, names man to head fights. A word about fight. I hear that over and over today. He lost his battle with cancer. Or we have to fight these flus and colds. And it's as though we see everything as a battle and a war. And so Nixon declared war on cancer. Well, of course, I would say to say you're going to declare war on cancer is a gross misunderstanding of the process of cancer, because it's a part of a malfunction within the body, and hence you would be declaring a war on your body if you really got down to it. Now, what it is that you need to understand the process of what's going on, and you need to correct the disturbed process. And it sounds principle and simple. In principle, very simple it sounds. But in fact, it's not quite that simple. The reason being, look at, you have all these billions of cells in the body, and trillions actually, and to do something that pretty much affects the bulk of those cells, it takes a bit of work. Now, the way we're going to approach this subject is, first of all, we're asking the question, are we winning the war on cancer? Now, when that bill was passed, and when Nixon signed it into law, it's very interesting that, they were very naive. For example, there were many people at that time said, we're estimating that by 1976 we will have solved this problem. Now, that was 5 years down the road from the signing of the bill. It's been a lot more than 5 years, and the question is, are we in fact getting ahead of the game? Are we in fact winning? And I guess it depends on how you look at it. I would have to answer that it's really yes and no. Yes, there's a lot known. Yes, there are methodologies that can help correct the problem. No, the cancer industry is not prevailing. They're not winning. In fact, the game, if you want to call it a game, the war, is actually staged such that it can never be won. And I hate to say this, but in the process, a lot of people will become very wealthy. Unfortunately, at the expense of the fodder for the wealth-generating machine, which happens to be the problem of cancer. Now, I have put together, this is not my stuff, this is stuff said by other people, other organizations, and some of them very knowledgeable organizations, and doctors that have spent years in the process. But there is a book by an author by the name of Moss, M-O-S-S, Ralph Moss, called The Cancer Industry, and I think that kind of can give you some insight into what it's all about. Now, first of all, before we get going on where we're at, at this point in terms of the cancer issue. Where have we gotten to? Let's talk a little bit about what cancer is. And cancer is kind of a broad, sweeping term that really is a hodgepodge of different types of things that all fall under that general category. And so when they talk about cancer, they're talking about the sum total of all these different categories of issues that come together and are referred to by the general term cancer. And so it would be all forms depending on the tissue. And you know, cancers form in different types of tissues, and in fact that's how they get their name. If you have something in the lymph that is considered to be malignant, then it's a lymphoma, either more often than not. There's different terms for it. One was called Burkitt's lymphoma, Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, either based on particular doctors who did a lot of research into it. But at any rate, the lymph is one group, the blood is another group. Now you talk about leukemias and so forth. And then you have the covering tissue of the body, the skin, the epidermis, and so then you end up into the carcinomas, and a carcinoma is a cancer of that type of tissue. Now, you probably remember me talking before about the different types of embryonic tissue that from a single cell, the cells as they replicate begin to differentiate into three different types of cells, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And out of those grow certain types of organs, tissues, or whatever. And so those that cover the body, those cells in the skin or the dermis, and those that line throughout the body, the linings of things, those all tend to develop carcinomas. So you will find the colon, for example. If you have colon cancer, it generally is a carcinoma. A basal cell carcinoma on the skin, or a squamous cell carcinoma. So the differentiation has to do with the type of cells as they're aberrated, meaning that they've changed their form. That's how sometimes they get the differentiation. Then there's adenocarcinomas, etc., ductal cell carcinomas. It just goes on and on. So it's either lining or covering tissue of some sort, which all come from what are called the ectoderm, embryonic tissue. And then there's the sarcomas, which have to do with connective tissue and so forth. And they can be particularly aggressive and pretty nasty. They're faster growing and so forth. So there's all these different types, and so after a while, I mean, you know, it's quite an education just to learn the names of all the different types of cancer formations or malignant formations that are referred to. So that in itself is a bit confusing, and I have trouble with the way it's laid out, but I had no say in it, so I guess we're stuck with what we have in terms of nomenclature. But I want to talk also a little bit about the process of cancer. Now, many people say that at the time Nixon signed the bill that the cancer industry, and I keep using the term industry because it has become a gigantic business, and when I say gigantic, it appears that on the average from the time a person is diagnosed until they have been cured to death, and again this is from regular medicine, the intake to the cancer industry is somewhere plus or minus $1 million. At least that's at current rates. Now, it wasn't that bad back along the way, but over the years, as everything has gone up in price, so hasn't the cancer industry's prices increased. And so we've gotten to the point today that it's an expensive ordeal. And we wonder why our so-called health parenthesis sick bill is so high, is because of the fact that the industry is kind of greedy. They want a lot of money. And they've come up with all kinds of treatments, whether worthless or even harmful, that have been accepted. They put pretty big price tags on them. Some of them as high as $100,000 a procedure. Before, I mentioned that in certain types of treatment with chemotherapies that the blood red cells start going down to nothing because the bone marrow was being poisoned and the process of making red cells is being poisoned. And so they developed this drug that they would inject, but thousands of dollars per injection, which was pretty outlandish, when in fact it probably in actual cost to make it maybe is 50 cents or $1, but they can charge several $1,000s per injection, and got away with it because nobody ever questions it. They think, oh well, they're doing the best they can, they're trying to help people, and so nobody bothers, especially when insurance picks it up. People don't give it a thought. But I remember there's a whole book on the whole process, and I've mentioned it before. And at any rate, one patient alone, just for that treatment, was in the neighborhood of $500,000 or $600,000 during the course of her treatment. And so you're talking about, in that case, far exceeding the $1 million before it was over for everything. But the whole industry is, in my mind, has unfortunately, and again, I'm not reflecting on doctors who do what they do with it, unless I get a little disturbed that they're not so open to looking at other alternatives. Most people who become oncologists are satisfied to do whatever the standard treatment is, and they will argue that this is the best there is and the people are crazy if they don't do this treatment. But I couldn't be an oncologist because I would have to know that 99% of the people that I get as patients are going to die and not live a long age. They're going to die, and I'm not laughing at the fact they don't live a long age. I'm laughing at the fact that somebody could choose a profession where they anticipate that almost every patient they treat will not survive. That could be very discouraging to me. And so, consequently, it's become, as I say, a massive industry. There's plenty of material out there about it. I don't have to tell you. But I do want to discuss a little bit about the process, and because of the process of a cell becoming a disturbed cell and ultimately leading to the growth of a tumor, I think there's some things that need to be understood, which also at the same time indicate the complexity of the problem. First of all, there's two things that tend to happen. A person is going along fine, their cells seemingly are working okay, and suddenly somewhere one or more cells in a group experience a transformation. Now, the transformation, I've studied this problem for years and years and years. I think I've read almost everything from around the world that's ever been proposed or hypothesized about cancer, causes of cancer, and treatment of cancer. Not that I'm obsessed with cancer, and I work on not being obsessed with it, because I found out a long time ago that people who obsess with a particular disease almost always end up with that disease. And so I don't want to obsess on anyone, and I think that's nice that what I do is so varied with so many different kinds of problems with people that I don't really ever get a chance to obsess on a particular illness because I get some of everything. However, there's a researcher out of France that for approximately 20 years was a researcher at the Pasteur Institute, and of course, as you well know, I've made some rather derogatory comments about Pasteur, and many people have referred to him as a fraud, as a hoax, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Now, I didn't initiate that, but there are people who have written books and articles about Pasteur, and they will freely say that he was a plagiarist and a fraud and so forth. But at any rate, the Pasteur Institute did become one of the great institutes as far as research. And remember that out of the Pasteur Institute, we have somebody by the name of Dr. Luc Montagnier. His name is greatly associated with AIDS, and there's a whole controversy about that. We've talked about AIDS before, and I'm going to do some point along the way here an update on AIDS and some of the stuff that's coming out, including from Luc Montagnier, who is supposedly one of the co-founders of what was called the HIV virus, which has been blamed on being the cause of AIDS, which I have grave doubts about. And there are even people who question the existence of a virus called HIV, but we won't even go into that. At any rate, this researcher, and his name was Dr. Mirko Belyansky, he worked as a researcher, a PhD researcher at the Pasteur Institute for around 20 years, if I've got the story straight. And at some point, they appointed a new director, and the new director, after him spending 20 years of researching cancer, wanted to pull him off and put him on something else, and he was not happy with that, leading to him separating himself from the Pasteur Institute and ultimately ending up setting up his own private research laboratory and continuing his work. And so, out of those years and years of research, he studied the interior of the cells, the DNA of the cells, the nucleus of the cell, and arrived at a conclusion that I think is very interesting, and it sounds very plausible. Now, all the things that I say on any of my broadcasts, and even today about this cancer thing, is that it's all subject to change if I get new information. Now, I'm not stuck on anything. I like to think I'm on a pursuit for truth, and if information I have ultimately is proven to be false, I'm willing to change and admit that it ended up not being good information. And at any rate, after having studied it all these years, I'm pretty convinced at this point that his ideas about what happens in the nucleus of a cell that becomes a malignant cell is pretty accurate. Now, he says that certain toxic materials have the capability of penetrating the nucleus of cells, and in the normal process of cell replication. Now, you understand, I'm sure, I don't know if I'm thinking way back along the way we've talked about DNA. In the process of replication, there is a sensing system in the body that determines that at some point a cell is no longer functional enough to continue as a part of your mass of cells. And so a signal is set in motion to, number one, replicate and make another copy, a brand new cell, and then number two, for that old cell to die off and be broken down and disposed of from the body. Now, that's the normal process of things. And that process of the cell normally dying off from having been worn out or depleted, and some people say it's the telomeres, and maybe it is, and when we talk about anti-aging, we'll get more into the telomeres. But at any rate, the decision is made by the wisdom of the body that this cell no longer is to remain in service. So it then is, by all these signals, now there's all kind of little signals called cell signals, or cell signalers, and at some point when we talk about age, we'll get into the cell signalers and a big issue that developed out of that. But at any rate, the cell then begins the process of building a new cell, or replicating itself. And it does so by making a copy of the genetic that ultimately becomes the new genetic in the nucleus of the new cell. And when that's all done, the cell separates from the new cell, and then the old cell, as I say, dies off, the process of apoptosis. Now, In order for that DNA to replicate, the double strand that is connected together has to temporarily separate to make that process occur. Once the enzymes that are in the nucleus of the cell activates a duplication of that, forming a like strand carrying the information, then that joins with other nucleic acids to create another strand, so that you have a new double strand that becomes then ultimately the nucleus in the DNA for the new cell. And as I say, the two cells separate or differentiate from each other. And the DNA, actually, of the old cell comes back together until the whole cell is disposed of. Now, what it appears, and this is what Belyansky came up with, that there are certain chemicals and toxins that we're exposed to that can penetrate all the way into the nucleus. And those toxins can be referred to as mutagens, and a certain group of the mutagens are carcinogens. Now, a mutagen means it's something that mutates the DNA. So it alters the code. It could cause problems. It could potentially not cause problems that we're aware of. Maybe down the road that we may pass, if we're young and we have children, we may pass it on in our code to our children, and then they may have a problem based on the mutation. But let's say in our case, a mutagen may create some health problems or issues, but not necessarily cancer. But a certain group of those mutagens can actually become carcinogenic. So Dr. Belyansky differentiates between mutagens and carcinogens. Okay, so what the carcinogen does, it blocks or inhibits the DNA strand from closing back up. Once that happens, if the strands stay separated, the body keeps by the enzymes that are present in the nucleus that starts to actually make more cells. And so it makes more cells and more cells and more cells, and it just keeps replicating cells. Okay, so his idea was, if that is what starts a cell being malignant, then something that could wipe out the carcinogen and allow the two strands to close back together and allow the cell to die off naturally as it normally would stop the process of replication. However, some of the cells that have already been generated, you now have a mass. And if you don't stop that, you're going to keep feeding the mass until you have a tumor. And so what happens is that the fast replicating cells start to actually crowd into other tissue, become invasive. They just keep growing and growing. And so what he wanted to do then was, if that's the problem, that the carcinogen blocks the closure of the DNA and allows the cell to keep replicating and replicating, what we need is some type of substance that can go in and wipe out the carcinogen and allow that closure. And so that's what he spent his latter years in, was trying to find something, and he ultimately turned to the natural field of herbs, looking for things that would cause that to happen, that could stop that. Okay, so now that's the basic process that over-replicates the cells. And see, what happens is it seems that those cells also lose contact with the body's control system, so that mass that's developing takes on a life of its own. I always think of the movie Alien, where this alien grew inside another person. Here we have an alien life form that's no longer listening to the body's signals, because every cell in your body could do that all the time if there were no control signals that said, okay, you replicate, you make a new cell, then you close back up the DNA, the cell gradually dies off and it's gone, and that's the end of it. That doesn't happen. So at any rate, that's one part of the problem, is the overreplication of cells. And so ultimately, Dr. Belyansky did come up with some factors out of some herbs from South America and Africa that had the capability of sweeping this garbage, this toxic carcinogen, out of the nucleus where the DNA was, and allowing the DNA to close up and allow the process to complete it naturally as it should. Okay, so now we have a tumor formation. But now in the process, these cells that were now made into a mass that have disconnected from the body, they don't have to stop replicating as long as they get nutrients. That's one issue. The second issue is, for some reason in the process, there is a control factor that keeps the cell from living indefinitely, having to do with the telomerase, which is a set of molecules on the end of each strand of DNA. And so every time that strand opens and replicates, a piece of that telomere is used up. And of course that has to do with anti-aging and some of the other things that we've talked about, and we'll talk about more later. So now you have this cell mass without any control, and it uncaps a gene that makes more enzymes that puts telomeres back on. So every time it replicates, the telomere is replaced, and therefore it's immortal. So you'll read about cancer cells being immortal. As long as they can get nutrients, they will replicate indefinitely and no limit. And we talked about the Hayflick limit before. That says a normal human cell, under normal conditions, will only replicate approximately 50 times, and then it won't replicate anymore. It goes into senescence, and or the body has to destroy the cell or whatever. So that's part of the anti-aging strategy, which we'll talk about later. But for whatever reason, that becomes uncapped because the body doesn't control it anymore. Otherwise, there's a control factor that keeps that telomerase from overexpressing and allowing us to live immortally. So now that's the problem with the malignancy. It just keeps going. And of course, sugar is the fuel to make energy, and it's grabbing protein or nitrogen like crazy, so it can rebuild faster and make more cells. So there is no rate of growth as well as growth control. So it can go fast and furious. There's another issue that somehow ties into that, and that was the work of Dr. Otto Warburg and the oxygen issue, because it appears that a cancer cell uses little or no oxygen, but uses primarily sugar in a fermentative process to make energy, and gives off lactic acid as a byproduct, which is further damaging to a lot of the surrounding tissue. And so the oxygen is another factor. Now, Warburg claimed that if you cut off the oxygen or diminish the oxygen supply to a cell, that it would turn to a malignant cell. Well, it definitely would change its energy production method, because our body has that capability anyhow. Because if we overexercise and we use up all of our ATP reserves, the body reverts to the glucose process, glycolysis, to make energy, which produces lactic acid, which in turn irritates the muscles and they get sore, which is why if you overuse your muscles, they get sore. So at any rate, now you have this oxygen problem also. But primarily, bottom line, it requires that the cell keep replicating and replicating without any control, and that gets the tumor started. But that's only one side of the problem. The other problem is the immune system. Now, some of the people say that back when Nixon signed the bill, they knew almost nothing about the immune system, and therefore they had no idea about that issue that had to be addressed. So the normal healthy body, if it does get a carcinogen and it does create a bad cell, it will actually wipe out the bad cell and get rid of it, and that's the end of it. If a bad cell is uncontrolled, it becomes uncontrollable and forms tumors. So there is the second part of the problem, is the immune system. The immune system is subject to a lot of things. It's subject to toxic metals disturbing it, and toxic materials, period, viruses, which is barely a cell toxin. All of those things can affect immune function, but the biggie has to do with the emotions. And the emotions can, in fact, shut down the thymus, which activates the T cells, which are a big part of the antibody part of the body. And so that can shut down your immune system under an emotional shock, and especially an unresolved emotional shock that stays in the unconscious, whether you're consciously thinking about it or not, can turn off the immune system and therefore impair your ability to break down these worn out cells. Therefore, there's a big problem. So consequently, we have those two issues to contend with. We have the cell becoming a mutant cell and overgrowing, and we have the problem with the immune system, because once a mutant cell occurred, if the body's working right, a message goes to the immune system to come and wipe out this bad cell. And inside, the cell is self-destructing anyhow, and so it wipes it out, and that's the end of it. Now, so those are the two big issues that we have to deal with. And there was a German doctor, and still is, but he's in exile in, I think, Iceland or someplace, but his name was Rilke Geerd Hammer. And he developed something called, ultimately, the German New Medicine. He was an oncologist, and he discovered over 20 years of working with 40,000 cancer people as an oncologist about the emotions in cancer, as well as Dr. O. Carl Simonton in this country found out the same thing. And so anyhow, he found that if he could actually do a brain scan, a CT scan of the brain, he could see a brain that had been traumatized by some type of an unresolved emotional conflict. And he had actually changed the physical structure of the body, visible on a CT scan. He then realized that depending on what part of the brain was affected, it would in turn affect some tissue in the body and make it prone to cancer. And so, consequently, he found that if he could find out what the unresolved issue was and could work with the person to eliminate that, guess what? The brain lesion that had formed as a result of the trauma began to resolve and to correct, and the tumor would shrink up and disappear. So now he was not having to use chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, etc. in almost every case. He didn't have to do that. So guess what? He was no longer needed in the medical profession, and he was certainly not needed as an oncologist, nor was he needed talking to people and influencing them. So bottom line is, he ended up in prison in France for a while, and eventually got out and fled the area, and last I heard he was in Iceland. However, there are people teaching his material, and we might talk about that a little bit more in the next session, because it looks like this is definitely going to be a 2-session broadcast. And so now we have the problem laid out. Here's the problem. And so the question is, how do you address that? Well, are you going to address it by cutting out a tumor? Well, can you cut out every cell? Because the cells, once they start replicating so rapidly, can start migrating. And you can't see one cell as malignant that's separated off in some distant spot. So that becomes a bad problem. The cancer is, as a rule, not going to be eliminated by surgery. Can you eliminate it by radiation? Well, not really, unless you fry the whole body. But if you fry the whole body, the person will die of radiation poisoning, so they're not going to make any difference anyhow. And can you do it by chemotherapy? Well, no, not really, because chemotherapy, if you gave enough to kill every cancer cell, you would kill every body cell also, and the person would be dead. And that would be like, as a friend of mine said, seeing a bee in your car and getting a flamethrower to get the bee out of your car. You might get rid of the bee, but you kind of get rid of your car in the process. So there's limits on the chemotherapy, but you can be sure of one thing: if you take the chemotherapy, it's going to wipe out your immune system, and you're going to guarantee that that one or two or few cells that they didn't kill are now going to become tumors down the road. And that's why after a period of time that people have gone through the treatment process, they find that the cancer's all over their body because there's nothing to stop it. So now you kind of know what the problem is. And I guess that we're about at a good breaking point because we're going to talk about the war on cancer. Where is it? What's really happened? And how close are we to really solving the problem? And number two, we're going to talk about some of the alternatives that have developed, a few of the alternatives. We can't do them all because it would take too much time. And I just want you to get the idea and to get out and start looking on your own. But we'll talk about the fact that cancer is worse than ever. And we will be talking about the fact that WHO, the World Health Organization, has said that cancer's on the increase all over the world, and it's becoming one of the major problems of the world. And so we'll be talking about their findings and their predictions that unless something changes, which I don't see too much signs of it at the moment, because the cancer industry is so protective of their industry, and it's so much money coming in. I mean, already since the bill was signed in 1971, I've seen estimates of as much as $300 to $500 billion have been spent on research in cancer, and we're basically no closer today. And what appears to be closer are actually, what do I want to say, manipulating the facts. Remember I told you before about a book called How to Lie with Statistics? Well, if you load it right, or if you distort it properly, you can make things appear that aren't true. And so basically, to keep people pouring money into the cancer industry, that is some of the things that have been resorted to, is just distorting the facts. And I'll just throw one in real fast, and that is the idea that they're using a term which is fudged, called the 5-year survival rate, and said, well, our 5-year survival rate is improved. However, a doctor who is into oncology and did a thorough investigation said, well, it's possible that it's true because of earlier diagnosis we might have more people that survive 5 years. However, the death rate has remained the same. So it depends on how you use the numbers, and of course you can bet that the industry that is pulling in over $100 billion a year in cancer diagnosis and treatment is certainly going to try to be sure that they maintain that income. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. We'll talk about what World Health Organization, WHO, has to say on it. Not who, but who. And that will kind of give you a picture of where we are in the war today, as they termed it. I wouldn't say the war. I would say in the investigation of ways that we can reduce and or eliminate pretty much the problem. And there are ways out there, but you're not going to hear about them generally. And if you do, it will only be in a negative way. It was nice to be with you again today. We've used up another period of time, and I look forward to continuing with the subject this next week. And we'll try to wrap it up at that point, but give you a good idea of some of the things that have happened that are going to be illustrative of what I have just told you, that there is no intent to get people well in the sense of solving the cancer problem. Now, I'm not saying some of the doctors that get into it, that's not on their mind, unless they're one of those doctors that got into the business of medicine. Then, yeah, I can say they're going to fall in that category. But there are some doctors who get in because they think they're going to help people, only to find out down the road they couldn't help people, and then they either get themselves in trouble, like several that I've known lost their license because they wanted to go other directions rather than the party line, and as a result, they paid a price for it. It was nice to be with you. Don't forget to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and click from there over to Alternative Health and Prevention. There is a link, and also peruse through our pages, and many of the things that I've referred to, and if not most of the books, are on the book section of my website. Until the next time, be healthy.